Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on, where you are in this world. This is Gloria White coming to you from Utah, USA. Today we are in the book of in the New Jerusalem Holy Bible, and we are in Second Maccabees. Blah. We are in Second Maccabees, and we are in chapter 12. Now, incidents at Joppa and Jamnia. These agreements once concluded, Lysias returned to the king, and the Jews went back to their farming. Among the local generals, Timotheus and Apollonius, son of Ginnaeus, as also Hieronymus and Demophon, and Nicanor the Cypriarch, as well, would not allow the Jews to live in peace and quiet. The people of Joppa committed a particularly wicked crime. They invited the Jews living among them to go aboard some boats they had lying ready, taking their wives and children. There was no hint of any intention to harm them. There had been a public vote by the citizens, and the Jews accepted, as well they might, being peaceable people, with no reason to suspect anything. But once out in the open sea, they were all sent to the bottom, a company of at least 200. When Judas heard of this cruel fate of his countrymen, he issued his orders to his men, and after invoking God, the just judge, he attacked his brother's murderers. Under cover of dark he set fire to the port, burned the boats, and put to the sword everyone who had taken refuge there. As the town gates were closed, he withdrew, intending to come back and wipe out the whole community of Joppa. But hearing that the people of Jamnia were planning to treat their resident Jews in the same way, he made a night attack on the Jammanites and fired the port with its fleet. The glow of the flames were seen as far off as Jerusalem, 30 miles. The expedition in Gilead. When they had left the town barely a mile behind them in their advance on Timotheus, Judas was attacked by an Arab force of at least 5,000 foot soldiers with 500 cavalry. A fierce engagement followed, and with God's help, Judas's men won the day. The defeated nomads begged Judas to offer them the right hand of friendship and promised to surrender their herds and make themselves generally useful to him. Realizing that they might indeed prove valuable in many ways, Judas consented to make peace with them, and after an exchange of pledges, the Arabs withdrew to their tents. Judas also attacked a certain fortified town, closed by ramparts and inhabited by a melody of races. Its name was Caspian. Confident in the strength of their walls and their stock of provisions, the besieged adopted an insolent attitude to Judas and his men, reinforcing their insults with blasphemies and profanity. But Judas and his men invoked the great sovereign of the world, who without battering ram or siege engine had overthrown Jericho in the day of Joshua. Then they made a fierce assault on the wall. By God's will, having captured the town, they made such indescribable slaughter that the nearby lake, a quarter of a mile across, seemed filled to overflowing with blood. The Battle of the Carnaim. 95 miles further on from there, they reached the Karax. In the country of Jews, known as Tubians. They did not find Timotheus himself in that neighborhood. He had already left the district, having achieved nothing apart from leaving a very strong garrison at one point. Dositheus and Sosipater, two of Maccabees' generals, marched out and destroyed the force Timotheus had left behind in the fortress, amounting to more than 10,000 men. Maccabeus himself divided his army into cohorts, to which he assigned commanders, and then hurried in pursuit of Timotheus, whose troop numbered 120,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. Timotheus' first move on learning of Judas's advance was to send away the women and children and the rest of the baggage train to the place called Carnium, since it was an impregnable position, difficult of access owing to its narrowness of all the approaches. Judas' cohort came into sight first. The enemy, seized with fright and panic-stricken by the manifestation of the all-seeing, began to flee, one running this way, one running that, often wounding one another in consequence, and running on the points of one another's swords. Judas pursued them with a will, cutting the sinners to pieces and killing something like 30,000 men. Timotheus himself, having fallen into the hands of Dositheus and Sosipater and their men, very craftily pleaded with them to let him go with his life, on the grounds that he had the relatives and even the brothers of many of them in his power, and that these could otherwise expect short shrift. When at long last he convinced them that he would honor his promise and return these people safe and sound, they let him go for the sake of saving their brothers. Reaching the Carnium and the Artagation, Judas slaughtered 25,000 men. They returned by way of Ephraim and Scythopolis. Having defeated and destroyed them, he led his army against Ephraim, a fortified town where Lysanias was living. Stalwart young men drawn up outside the walls offered rigorous resistance, while inside there were quantities of war machines and missiles in reserve. But the Jews, having invoked the sovereign who by his power shatters enemies' defenses, gained control of the town and cut down nearly 25,000 of the people inside. Moving off from there, they pressed on to Scythopolis, 75 miles from Jerusalem. But as the Jews who had settled there assured Judas that the people of Scythopolis had always treated them well and had been particularly kind to them when times were at their worst, he and his men thanked them and urged them to extend the same friendship to his race in the future. They reached Jerusalem shortly before the Feast of Weeks. The campaign against Gorgias. After Pentecost, as it is called, they marched against Gorgias, the general commanding Idumea. He came out at the head of 3,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. In the course of the ensuing battle, a few Jews lost their lives. A man called Dositheus, a horseman of the Tubian contingent, a valiant man, overpowered Gorgias, and gripping him by the cloak, was forcibly dragging him along, intending to take the accursed man alive. But one of the Thracian cavalry, hurling himself on Dositheus, slashed his shoulder, and Gorgias escaped to Marissa. Meanwhile, since Esdras and his men had been fighting for a long time and were exhausted, Judas called on the Lord to show himself their ally and leader in battle. Then, chanting the battle cry and hymns at the top of his voice, in his ancestral tongue, by a surprise attack, he routed Gorgias's troops. The sacrifice for the fallen. Judas then rallied his army and moved on to the town of Adullam, where, as it was the 7th day of the week, they purified themselves according to custom and kept the Sabbath. Next day they came to find Judas, since the necessary was by now urgent, to have the bodies of the fallen taken up and laid to rest among their relatives in their ancestral tombs. But when they found on each of the dead men, under their tunics, objects dedicated to the idols of Gemia, which the law prohibits to Jews, it became clear to everyone that this was why these men had lost their lives. All then blessed the ways of the Lord, the upright judge who brings hidden things to light, and gave themselves to prayer, begging that the sin committed might be completely forgiven. Next, the valiant Judas forged the soldiers to keep themselves free from all sin, having seen with their own eyes the effects of the sin of those who had fallen. After this, he took a collection from them individually, amounting to nearly 2,000 drachmas, and sent it to Jerusalem to have a sacrifice for a sin offered, an action altogether fine and noble, prompted by his belief in the resurrection. For had he not expected the fallen to rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. Whereas if he had in view the splendid recompense reserved for those who make a pious end, the thought was holy and devout. Hence he had his expiatory sacrifice offered for the dead, so that they might be released from their sin. Chapter 13. The campaign of Antioch V and Lysias' horrible death of Menelaus. In the year 149, Judas and his men discovered that Antioch Eupator was advancing in force against Judea, and with him Lysias, his tutor and chief minister. He had moreover a Greek force of 110,000 infantry, 5,300 cavalry, 22 elephants, and 300 chariots fitted with scythes. It's like sickles to cut the wheat. Menelaus, too, joined them and very craftily kept urging Antioch on, not for the welfare of his own country, but in the hope of being restored to office. But the King of Kings stirred up the anger of Antioch against the guilty wretch, and when Lysias made it clear to the king that Menelaus was the cause of all the troubles, Antioch gave orders for him to be taken to Beroea, and there put to death by local method of execution. In that place there is a tower 50 cubits high, full of ash, with an internal lip all around overhanging the ashes. If anyone is convicted of sacrilegious theft, or of some other heinous crime, he is taken up to the top and pushed over to perish. In such a manner, was the renegade fated to die. Menelaus had not even the privilege of burial, deserved justice, this since he had committed many sins against the altar, the fire and ashes of which were holy. It was in ashes that he met his death. The prayer and success of the Jews near Modin. The king then was advancing his mind filled with barbarous designs to give the Jews a demonstration of far worse things than anything that had happened under his father. When Judas heard of this, he ordered the people day and night to call on the Lord as never before, to come to the help of those who were in peril of being deprived of the law, their fatherland and the holy temple, and not to allow the people, just when they were beginning to breathe again, to fall into the power of ill-famed foreigners. When they had all, with one voice, obeyed his instructions, and had made their petitions to the merciful Lord, weeping, fasting, prostrating themselves for 3 days continually, Judas spoke words of encouragement and told them to keep close to him. After separate consultation with the elders, he resolved not to wait for the king's army to invade Judea and take possession of the city, but to march out and settle the whole matter with the Lord's help. Having thus committed the outcome to the Creator of the world, and having exhorted his soldiers to fight bravely to the death for the laws, the temple, the city, their country, and their way of life, he encamped his army near Modin. Giving his men the password, "Victory from God," he made a night attack on the king's pavilion with a picked band of the bravest young men. Inside the camp he destroyed about 2,000, and his men cut down the larger of the elephants with its mehut. Having eventually filled the camp with terror and confusion, they successfully withdrew, just as dawn was breaking. This was achieved thanks to the protection of the Lord granted Judas. Antioch V negotiates with the Jews. The king, having had a taste of Jewish daring, now tried to capture their positions by trickery. He advanced on Beth Zur, a strong fortress of the Jews, but was checked, overcome, and so repulsed. Judas supplied the garrison with what they needed, but Rhodocus of the Jewish army supplied the enemy with secret information. The man was identified, arrested, and dealt with. A second time the king parleyed with the garrison of Beth Zur. He offered and accepted pledges of friendship, retired, then attacked Judas and his men, but lost the battle. He was then told that Philip, left in charge of affairs, had rebelled in Antioch. He was stunned by this, opened negotiation with the Jews, came to an agreement, and swore to abide by all reasonable conditions. Agreement reached, he offered a sacrifice, honored the temple, and made generous gifts to the holy place. He received Maccabees kindly, and leaving Hegemonides to exercise command from Ptolemais to the territory of Gerrenians, went to Ptolemais. The inhabitants of the place disapproved of the treaty. They complained furiously and wanted to annul its provisions. Lysias mounted the rostrum and made a convincing defense of the provisions, which convinced and calmed them and won their goodwill. He then withdrew to Antioch. So much for the episode of the king's offensive and retreat. Let's see. Yep. Okay. Now we'll stop here and we'll pick that up again tomorrow We will be in section 7, chapter 14. And as always, I love you.